Did you know? In the investigation, police discovered that the killer consistently wore rare Avia sneakers, and the unique shoe prints left at multiple crime scenes became one of the first major forensic clues that helped investigators link the attacks together, something most people never hear about when the case is told. Case number 1, Police Archive Files, documenting criminal cases that marked history. Tonight, we open the file of a name that once kept an entire city awake at night. The night was thick with dread, a palpable tension hanging in the air of Los Angeles. It was 1985, and the city was gripped by fear. A shadowy figure was on the loose, a predator stalking the streets, leaving a trail of terror in his wake. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, was not just a name. He was a nightmare that had come to life. And what made the fear even worse was the randomness. There was no predictable pattern, no single neighborhood, no consistent victim profile. Anyone could be next. That uncertainty transformed anxiety into something deeper, collective psychological terror. Residents slept with lights on. Hardware stores reported surges in lock and alarm purchases. Entire communities began organizing neighborhood watches almost overnight. Because when danger feels random, the mind never truly rests. In the span of just a few months, Ramirez committed a series of brutal home invasions, rapes, and murders. The statistics were staggering: 13 confirmed murders, 5 attempted murders, and over a dozen sexual assaults. Each crime was more heinous than the last, and the media frenzy only intensified the panic. The city that once thrived under the glow of Hollywood lights now trembled in darkness. But investigators were asking a different question: not only who was committing these crimes, but what psychological mechanisms drive someone to escalate this quickly. Born in El Paso, Texas in 1960, Ramirez was the youngest of 5 children in a family marked by violence and dysfunction. His father, a former police officer, was abusive, and his childhood was shaped by repeated exposure to aggression. Modern criminological studies show that chronic childhood exposure to violence significantly alters emotional regulation systems, increasing impulsivity, reducing empathy responses, and heightening sensation-seeking behavior later in life. Risk factors frequently present in serial violent offenders. And in Ramirez's developmental history, those risk factors appeared early. During adolescence, he was heavily influenced by an older cousin, a Vietnam War veteran, who exposed him to graphic wartime experiences, violent photographs, and drug use. Behavioral psychologists later suggested that this combination of trauma exposure, substance abuse, and social isolation may have accelerated the formation of violent fantasy cycles, internal narratives where aggression becomes psychologically rewarding rather than disturbing. Because violence, when repeated enough in the mind, can become normalized. In 1984, Ramirez moved to Los Angeles and began committing burglaries and small-scale crimes. But by the summer of 1985, something shifted. His first known murder victim, 79-year-old Jenny Vincow, marked the beginning of a rapid escalation pattern that criminologists later described as compressed progression, where offenders move from non-violent crimes to lethal violence in an unusually short time frame. This was not gradual evolution, it was acceleration. As the summer continued, the Night Stalker's attacks expanded across multiple regions, particularly the San Gabriel Valley. He entered homes through unlocked doors or windows, often attacking victims while they slept. He used firearms, knives, and blunt force methods interchangeably, an indication of opportunistic violence rather than ritual-bound repetition. That adaptability made profiling far more difficult for investigators. Behavioral analysis units later described Ramirez as fitting a hybrid organized-disorganized offender classification. He demonstrated mobility, escape awareness, and selective targeting, traits associated with organized offenders, yet also displayed impulsive brutality, chaotic crime scenes, and erratic escalation, which are typically linked to disorganized offenders. And that combination created investigative chaos. One of the most disturbing psychological components of his crimes was the deliberate use of terror as a control mechanism. Survivors reported being forced to listen to threats, prayers, or violent statements before attacks occurred. Forensic psychologists note that this behavior is often associated with power dominance offenders, individuals who derive psychological reinforcement not only from the crime itself, but from the victim's fear response leading up to it. In other words, the fear was part of the objective. One of the most harrowing incidents occurred on July 28, 1985, when Ramirez broke into the home of Maria and Vincent Zazzara. After killing Vincent, he assaulted Maria and carved a pentagram into her chest. This symbol later became widely recognized as part of his public persona, but investigators noted that symbolic violence often serves a psychological function for offenders. It externalizes identity, transforming crimes into messages rather than isolated acts. As the body count rose, the pressure on law enforcement intensified. The LAPD coordinated one of the largest manhunts in the region's history at the time, integrating forensic analysis, behavioral profiling, interagency cooperation, and widespread public alert campaigns. Yet Ramirez remained elusive, frequently traveling across counties using stolen vehicles and leaving minimal traceable personal patterns. And with every successful escape, his myth grew. Media coverage amplified the fear, and psychologists later described the Night Stalker period as a case study in collective urban anxiety, where sustained uncertainty triggers behavioral shifts across entire populations, changes in routines, sleep patterns, purchasing behavior, and even mobility decisions. Then came the turning point. On August 30th, 1985, residents in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a police sketch and pursued him. In a desperate attempt to escape, he tried to steal a vehicle, but the residents refused to let him disappear. They detained him until police arrived. It was not advanced surveillance technology that ended the manhunt. It was public recognition. During the subsequent trial, Ramirez displayed a chilling demeanor, often smiling or gesturing toward cameras and spectators. Courtroom psychologists later interpreted his behavior as a form of identity consolidation, where offenders embrace the notoriety associated with their crimes, reinforcing the persona that media coverage helped construct. He was eventually convicted on 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of sexual assault in 1989, receiving a death sentence. He remained on death row for decades, until his death in 2013 from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. But while the legal case closed, the psychological impact did not. Communities affected by the attacks reported lingering behavioral changes for years afterward. Security practices that began as temporary responses became permanent habits. Neighborhood watch groups continued operating long after the arrests, and law enforcement agencies began investing more heavily in coordinated interdepartmental databases, recognizing that future serial investigations would depend on faster information sharing. The Night Stalker era reshaped policing coordination, accelerated the use of behavioral profiling in serial investigations, and influenced how media coverage of violent offenders is analyzed today. More importantly, it left a lasting reminder that the greatest societal fears are often not driven solely by violence itself, but by unpredictability. Because predictable danger can be prepared for, random danger cannot. The story of Richard Ramirez remains a chilling reminder that the line between ordinary life and chaos can sometimes be far thinner than people imagine. And even decades later, the shadows of that summer still echo through the history of Los Angeles, a reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear are not creatures of fiction, but people who once walked the same streets as everyone else.